All right, so let's talk about Ed Snowden. And let me tell you what I think Ed Snowden is. I think Ed Snowden is a limited hangout. And what is a limited hangout? Well, I'll give you the definition from Wikipedia because it's pretty concise. And for once, Wikipedia is right about this. They're not frequently right anymore. It's become a disinformation source. But, you know, if you get to something that is not central to politics or to their particular agenda, it can sometimes be accurate. So as Wikipedia points out, when the intelligence agencies can't or don't want to continue to hide something, when they can't or don't want to continue to hide something, they will release a phony cover story to misinform the public. And the purpose of that is to get the public satisfied, get them, this is, look at this. And after the news cycle is done and they move on to some other squirrel, they're intrigued by that and they don't pursue it any further because now they believe that they've been informed about what's going on. Now, what was going on with Snowden, in my opinion, is that you had one of the reasons why James Clapper was being cross-examined by Ron Wyden just a couple of months before the Snowden leak happened was because James Clapper, DNI at the time, had been for over 20 years kind of at the center of geospatial intelligence, which is at the center of the Dragnet Surveillance. And what we are now going to be seeing as the constant tracking in the name of, COVID and so forth. But it's what the Chinese are doing with their biometric tracking, with their social credit scores. It's important for them to know where everybody is at all these different times. And with geospatial intelligence, they can map out your relationships with other people, not just following where you are all the time. No. The important thing is to know what your political beliefs are, what your religious beliefs are, who you are associating with, and so forth and so on. And that's really the central part of it. Now, that has been the fastest growing part of the intelligence community since the late 1990s, as they began to make the internet the backbone for all of this. And again, the internet was designed by a DARPA psychologist back in the 1960s, J.C.R. Licklider. He called it the Intergalactic Computer Network. But it was designed by a psychologist. Why? Because they want to be able to monitor everything that you do. They want to eventually be able to not only just put out open-ended propaganda as a broadcast, which they were already doing with Operation Mockingbird and so forth for a long time, of course, going back to early 20th century. America was way ahead of the Nazis and Goebbels. We had Edward Bernays and Wall Street. That's where he went after he lied us into a war for Woodrow Wilson. But the Americans were the ones who were the premiers in terms of that kind of open-ended propaganda. But see, what the internet does is it gives them a closed-loop feedback. It allows them to monitor your response to their propaganda and fine-tune it. And that's what we now see with social media, isn't it? And so as they came up with this concept in the 1960s, they didn't have the technology to make it happen. But once the bandwidth of the internet became practical in the late 1990s, they started putting their people on the boards of venture capital firms to make sure it was going to happen. The CIA even openly created a venture capital firm, In-Q-Tel, which is something they typically don't go that openly. That's how important it was for them to openly do this. And they also began actively pushing geospatial intelligence, activity-based intelligence, human domain analytics, and so forth, to be able to map out people that they were going to be taking out in terms of taking out of the loop right now, taking you out of communications and limiting your communications. And so they set up the social media people. They began the geospatial intelligence, and James Clapper was one of the central people there. I believe that's one of the reasons why he was DNI, Director of National Intelligence. And Ron Wyden knew that Dragnet Surveillance was going on, and I think he knew that he was, not just that Dragnet Surveillance was going on, that was exposed by William Binney and Thomas Drake and James Weirby and others, several NSA whistleblowers who right after 9/11 said, look, we have a way that we can follow people anonymously And we've developed this internally. But because of corruption and because you want to go further, you have ignored what we created, which would protect people's privacy. And you've gone with these outside contractors that you've showered with a lot of cash to both, pay off your people and to destroy the Constitution. We need to stop this. Nobody paid any attention to the NSA whistleblowers. As a matter of fact, they tried to put them in jail. They tried to manufacture evidence against them, just like they did Judy Mikovits. And so by the time you get to 2013 and James Clapper goes to that hearing and he is asked point blank by Ron Wyden, are you doing this? And he goes, well, not deliberately, of course, right? He committed perjury. Perjury under oath to Congress, to the American public about something that is substantial. This is not like the alleged perjury of Roger Stone, which was not even, if it was even true, and it wasn't. Not even about anything that was substantial. This was substantial, and nobody, Republican or Democrat, over the 5 years, came after him to bring this perjury charge. Statute of limitations expired. And just a couple of months after that happened, Ed Snowden does the leak. They could no longer keep the Dragnet Surveillance, geospatial intelligence programs secret. And they're pretty big. I mean, prior to the lockdown, not having any conventions, they would typically have about 4,000 people show up every year for these geospatial intelligence conventions. Nobody even uses that word. You'll never hear that word used in mainstream media. You won't even really hear it used in alternative media. Geospatial intelligence, write it down. That's what this is all about. That is the core technology. And so when we have Ed Snowden go on Joe Rogan, let me play you a little bit of the clip here, and I'll comment on it when we come back. Let's play video clip number 5.
First of all, congratulations on the recent ruling. Was a 9th District Court of Appeals. Is that what it was? It said that what you exposed with the warrantless wiretapping was, in fact, illegal. And there are many people that are calling for you to be pardoned now.
Yeah, it's so much has happened. This ruling, this is actually not the first time the federal government has, or the appeals courts have struck down some of the federal surveillance programs as unlawful. But this one is really important because it happened from an appeals court. It wasn't from a single judge. It was from a panel of judges. And what they had ruled was that the NSA...
Because what he's saying here, well, this is important because we've now had a couple of appeals court judges say that Dragnet surveillance in violation of the Constitution is, in fact, illegal. Imagine that. You really think they're going to do anything about this? They let Clapper lie about it. It's a limited hangout, Ben. It's still a limited hangout, and we'll tell you why and what is coming when we come back. Stay with us.
First of all, congratulations on the recent ruling. Was a 9th District Court of Appeals. Is that what it was? It said that what you exposed with the warrantless wiretapping was, in fact, illegal. And there are many people that are calling for you to be pardoned now.
Yeah, it's so much has happened. This ruling, this is actually not the first time the federal government has, or the appeals courts have struck down some of the federal surveillance programs as unlawful. But this one is really important because it happened from an appeals court. It wasn't from a single judge. It was from a panel of judges. And what they had ruled was that the NSA's bulk collection of Americans' phone records was illegal. And this is the very first sort of mass surveillance program that I and the journalists, really the news was broken back in 2013. So this is a huge victory for privacy rights. What it means is there was this provision of the Patriot Act. Like, remember the Patriot Act? Remember, like, a zillion years ago?
I do.
Everybody was like, oh, Patriot Act, Patriot Act. Your friend Alex Jones, I think he was worried about the Patriot Act.
It's a terrible name. There's a real problem with that name. Because if you're against the Patriot Act, it's like against babies. It's like this is the Pro-Baby Act. But meanwhile, Pro-Baby Act, they get to look through your email.
Yeah. Has Joe Rogan never noticed that they do that with every piece of draconian unconstitutional legislation. They always give it a name that is exactly the opposite of what it is. As a matter of fact, when they claimed to reform this before, they called it the Freedom Act. And so, yeah, it's always that way. Always that way. Nevertheless, talking about the Patriot Act, yeah, it was a horrible thing. And we are now beyond that. We don't even bother to pass an act to take away people's liberties, to suspend the Constitution. We're now 184 days into that. There was never any COVID act. Well, actually, there was, wasn't it? It was rushed in there right along the same time when they laid the foundation for this. The same time they put in the Patriot Act, they pushed out the legislation to the states to give themselves the power to do what they're doing right now. And nobody is defending the rule of law. Not at the state level, not at the federal level, not in the courts, not in the White House, not in the Congress. Nobody is defending it. They're all pretending it doesn't exist. They'd all rather talk about something else. But when we look at this, of course, as I said, I think that Ed Snowden is a limited hangout. I think that it had gotten to a very uncomfortable point. This had been going on for so long. In 2013, it had been going on for 12 years. Benny and Drake and others had pointed that out. And you had Ron Wyden getting James Clapper to commit perjury. And that got Michael Hayden, former director of the NSA, former director of the CIA. He got very upset with Ron Wyden. I played the clips for you when he went to Washington and Lee University, and he said, I'm so upset with Ron Wyden. He knew that we were doing that. He knew that. Every senator there knew that. Everybody on their staff knew that. And he put him in an awkward position where he had to lie. You see, the other senators and all the other staff members have been lying to you about that. And, of course, nobody did anything to him for committing perjury, but that was kind of a risky thing for them. So, they dropped the information, a limited hangout. Now, there was a lot of information in the Snowden documents that was important. I've showed you some of the information. I do it on a regular basis. The PRISM program, but there was a lot of ambiguity about that. Even as we would tie that to Alex Karp's company that had the PRISM program, Palantir, that had all these references to Tolkien's Palantir. And of course, the Palantir, if you remember, was the crystal ball that the principals could communicate with each other. But as they were communicating with each other over these crystal balls, the Dark Lord couldn't see everything that they were doing. And not only that, but he could see into them in that story. And that's exactly what they do with their geospatial intelligence, with their activity-based intelligence, with their human domain analytics. And if you go back to that slide that you just had up there with the different circles, you will see that the very first company that got involved there was Microsoft, and the very last one that got involved was Apple, and they waited until after Steve Jobs is gone. Another one of the slides that they had there, where they're celebrating the fact that they had turned, in spite of the fact that Steve Jobs had talked about 1984, there's a series of 3 slides. Didn't really get too much press here in the U.S., but it was released as part of the Snowden documents. And the German press, Der Spiegel, picked up on that. And so they were laughing about the fact that even though Steve Jobs introduced the Macintosh with a 1984 commercial, said, who would have thought in 1984 that this would become Big Brother? And they showed Steve Jobs holding up an iPhone, and that the idiots would pay for it. They would line up and pay for it. They're talking about how they spied on you. The NSA mocking you for paying for your tracking device. Now, you think because you've got a judge there, this is another limited hangout. What happened with Joe Rogan and Ed Snowden was just another limited hangout. Oh, we're all fine now, right? Because we've had a couple of judges say that it's illegal 7 years after the fact. After he did it. 20 years after the fact, essentially. This is a long-running thing, folks, and if you're not safe with the Constitution, you're not going to be safe with a 3-judge ruling either. They don't pay any attention to this. I'll say one more thing about Ed Snowden. When he came out with his book, when he came out with Permanent Record, here it is right here. This book. Pick this up, guys. See all these tabs in here? All these tabs? I bought this the afternoon it came out. Stayed up all night and read it. Took notes. Did a full book report on it the next day because I thought it was important. And I'm absolutely convinced that this guy is a limited hangout. And if you read his book, you will know that he is a limited hangout. He spends the first third of the book talking about what a genius he is. And then he talks about how because of 9/11 and because he wanted to defend us from those dastardly criminals who took down 3 skyscrapers with 2 airplanes, he says he went to war. The greatest regret of my life, he said, is my reflexive, unquestioning support for that decision. I was outraged, yes, but that was only the beginning of a process in which my heart completely defeated my rational judgment. I accepted all the claims retailed by the media as facts. I repeated them as if I were being paid for it. I embraced the truth constructed for the good of the state, which in my passion I confused with the good of the country. And he says it was as if whatever individual politics that I developed, because he said he had been anti-war, so he's trying to justify the fact that he joined the military. And then, of course, he gets into the CIA. He said the anti-institutional hacker ethos installed in me online and the apolitical patriotism I'd inherited from my parents both wiped from my system. I'd been rebooted as a willing vehicle of vengeance. The sharpest part of the humiliation comes from acknowledging how easy this transformation was and how readily I welcomed it. He doesn't ever say that 9/11 was a false flag. Instead, what he's doing is virtue signaling to his leftist base, apologizing for having joined the military. Because further on in the book, he goes on to say, if you realize that the CIA has its own internet and its own web, it has its own kind of Facebook, which allows agents to interact socially, its own kind of Wikipedia. And he was happy that he had all this inside information. He said the first thing everyone looks up on the CIA's internal networks are aliens and 9/11. But see, of course, both of those are true, according to him. I don't know about the aliens, but 9/11 is. And he goes on to say, in case you're wondering, yes, man really did land on the moon. Climate change is real, and chemtrails are not a thing. And he knows all this. Why? Because, he's had the inside information. He knows that 9/11 is real. Well, he shouldn't have joined the military, but he knows it's all real. He is limited hangout. And if you think that any of this stuff has changed, it hasn't changed. The NSA chief who oversaw all of this stuff has now joined the Amazon board as a director. That just happened a couple of days ago. You think this stuff is going to change? Google's geofence warrants are now locking people up because they're in a proximity to something. And of course, now they're saying, well, we're not going to do that for other crimes, but we'll do it for contact tracing to protect you from disease. This is how this is all being rolled out. We'll be right back. All right, so how do we escape this constant surveillance? Actually, it's about to get much worse. Because as I said before, this was designed this way from the very beginning in the 1960s. And it was in the 1990s when bandwidth made it practical for them to do this stuff, that they began laying the traps, creating the alliances with tech companies. It's coincidental that, I guess, the time that they were running all this stuff, and they were setting up venture capital firms, In-Q-Tel by the CIA, putting their people from the NSA and other agencies on the boards of other venture capital firms besides the CIA's own. And, cherry picking the people like Zuckerberg and so forth who were going to be running the internet for them as shell corporations, front organizations. At the same time that was happening, they just happened to start a antitrust move against Bill Gates. And then he reinvented himself as a philanthropist, and then he seemed to join sides with them. But as I pointed out before we went to break, we now have the guy who ran all this stuff now going over to Amazon. We have Bill Gates, of course, everywhere he's going. He's looking to set up a global ID. That's the central part of all of this stuff, isn't it? To be able to track you. And of course, he's had his own people at the Gates Foundation wringing their hands and saying, well, what are we going to do? Because, these new vaccines that we've come out with, these RNA modifying vaccines, and they're going to have to be done twice at the beginning. You get one shot and then 30 days later you get another shot. We got to be able to track to see if people have gotten both their shots and where they get them. And they're going to be setting this up and doing these shots, and they're going to be getting shots from people that they don't know. How'd they know that? I'm not going to go into it today, but I've had some documents sent to me by a listener, very concerned about their job, but they sent me copies of documents showing that they are constructing for the military buildings that are going to be, as they say, for phlebotomy and for vaccination. This is what is part of President Trump's Operation Warp Speed, using the military, not just to deliver, but probably to inject vaccines on people. And you've got the Gates guy saying, well, we got a problem now, because how do we know if they really got it? Well, why do you need to know? Why does he need to know? Why is it any of Bill Gates' business? Why is it any of Donald Trump's business if I got a vaccine? It isn't. It isn't any of your business. But you're going to make it your business, aren't you? And what he's saying is we've got to have a way to track these people. That's one of the reasons why Bill Gates has been coming up with his, tattoo and vaccine all in one. That's why they've pushed this in India. Bill Gates has been at the center of the Aadhaar system, a 12-digit number. And you don't do anything now in India unless you've got that number, just like they've done in China. Chinese government, they've got their track and trace system. And now, combined with a social credit score. And now it's got to be done, to save you from the COVID disease. That's the justification. And it's being done here, too. DHS, here in America, is proposing a massive expansion of biometric modality collection. And you've got Ed Snowden out there saying, look at this, we won. They said it's illegal to do this stuff. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? You got Bill Gates out there with his surveillance, satellite surveillance. Earth Now, a couple of years ago. Yeah, we can see anybody almost anywhere on Earth. Satellite surveillance. We've got a network of 20,000 satellites been approved for Elon Musk to put up. Now, of course, it's to do 5G. And if that was all it was going to do, that would still be worrying. Because just as we saw in the 1990s, as bandwidth took a big leap forward, 5G and the bandwidth of tyranny that comes with that allows them to do all kinds of things that they've not been able to do before. This kind of real-time tracking, this type of social credit score, this type of real-time biometric identification. This is what's really concerning. As Zero Hedge points out about Google's geofence warrants, they go back to a case that is now just rolling out 2 years ago. It was the first time a man had been falsely accused and arrested based on a geofence warrant. And so what they can do with geofencing, and if you remember, at the very beginning of when they were still talking about the lockdown, and I said, look at this, you've got Drudge putting this out, saying that you've got this company called LocateX, and they have an app called Babel Street, or it was the other way around, I forget which one's the company, which one's the app. They're saying, yeah, we can do geofencing, and we can track people, do contact tracing with this. All of this stuff converges. Population control, depopulation with poison, and then tracking the people who remain. That's what the vaccine is about. That's what the 5G is about. Killing people and tracking the survivors. It's just that simple, folks. And this is how this is going to work. In 2018, for the first time, a man was falsely accused and arrested based on a controversial geofence warrant. You basically say to the tech companies, I want to know everybody that came into a particular geographical area. And you know that because you're tracking everybody all the time on their little devices. They all lined up and bought Big Brother. 23-year-old Jorge Molina, arrested and jailed for 6 days on suspicion of killing another man. A man, by the way, named Knight. Anyway, officers told him they knew 100% without a doubt, quote unquote, that his phone was at the scene of the crime, based on data from Google. And of course, nobody would go anywhere without their phone, except his phone went somewhere without him. He wasn't there. He had simply lent an old phone to a man that the police later arrested. They told Jorge, we know 100% without a doubt your phone was at the shooting scene. He gasped and said, what? This feels like a freaking nightmare. Yeah, it is a nightmare. And it is a nightmare that is coming for each and every one of us. He's now suing Google for $1.5 million. They don't need to have tracking. I mean, they'll use people to spy on each other, as the UK is doing. They're now saying it's COVID contraventions, and they're encouraging people to do that. And people are making the obvious connections to the East German Stasi. And when I talked to William Binney about it, he says, spent decades watching East Germany. And he said, what we have here, and he was global technical head for the NSA. He said, what we already have here, and Now, that was 5-6 years ago. What we already have here is far worse than anything the East Germans had because of the technology leverage and because of the bandwidth. And so we know exactly how this is going to be used. It's going to be used to track and trace us, to shut down anybody's speech. We've already had Google shut down Scott Atlas, the one person in the Trump administration that would push back against these mandates by Fauci. And they shut it down. As one person said, well, whether or not you agree with him, he does have some science that he can comment on, but whether or not you agree with him, Google should not be censoring him, because this is a guy who is a White House advisor. We ought to be able to know what he is saying, whether you agree with it or not. But no, Google is going to tell you whether or not you can have that. As a matter of fact, they're trying. You've now got a Democrat representative, Lois Frankel, calling for big tech to censor Laura Loomer's campaign. Because why? That's her opponent. This is how this is going to roll out. Well, folks, I don't have time. I'll do this tomorrow about the 730 MAX versus the Operation Warp Speed VAX. We'll talk about those two things tomorrow, the censorship and so forth. There's another interesting story, absolutely amazing. This just broke. Gateway Pundit, a Milwaukee Trump supporter who has a Trump train flag on his house. Obviously, that makes him a racist. And so the mob shows up and demonstrates for 2 hours. He calls the police. They don't show up. He comes outside with a gun, and now he's been arrested. Because obviously he's racist, because obviously he's a Trump supporter. This is the way this is rolling. They went specifically to his house to protest him for, quote, being a racist. So is this passive-aggressive for them, or is it just aggressive? And do you have a right on your own property to hold a firearm to protect yourself against a mob? Well, evidently not in Milwaukee. Well, we got a lot to cover tomorrow that I didn't get to today, but that's the end of our broadcast. Folks, if you want to keep this broadcast going, I just see the Drudge Report there. They say Fox News is cutting back with layoffs. They have no hair and makeup now, people. I haven't ever had any hair or makeup, people, as you obviously can tell. But if you want to keep us on the air just to talk, maybe you just want to get the podcast and not actually look at me. But if you want to keep us on the air, the only way to do that is with products that we sell at InfoWarsStore.com. And we got some great specials right now, up to 60% off, free shipping. Alexa Pure Breeze now is about half price. Free shipping on that. We have the 8-pack Power Stack, 60% off, free shipping. DNA Force Plus, 50% off and free shipping. InfoWarsStore.com. Folks, we got some great products to protect your health and to protect free speech at the same time. InfoWarsStore.com. Thanks for listening.